So today we are marking the launch of a new major collection of filmed interviews about the Third Reich, the Second World War, and the Holocaust and their legacies. Documentary filmmaker Luke Holland, who sadly passed away last year, recorded the accounts of men and women who were among the witnesses, beneficiaries, collaborators, facilitators, and in some cases perpetrators of Nazi persecution. Luke and his production company, ZEF Productions, the Institut National de l'Audiovisual, or INA for short, UCL and the Wiener Holocaust Library have worked together to ensure that these interviews can be accessed for research. From the 15th of November, researchers will be able to register to view the interview collection at reading rooms across France and in London using the INA's viewing platform INA Media Pro. Researchers will be able to study an archive of around 500 hours of unedited video interviews with more than 250 men and women recorded in several countries, including especially Germany and Austria, but also France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, among others. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Sam Pope, editor at ZEF Productions, who worked with Luke for many years and who will talk about the collection's history and Luke's film Final Account, which premiered last year and which is based on a selection of the interviews. And subsequently, Mary Fulbrook, professor of German history at UCL, will talk about the wider historical context of the interviews. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone here for joining us for this event today. In particular, our archival partners for their tireless work and support over these many years. It's been a long journey and a tough journey, and without them, they have helped us develop this archive into something incredibly special, something that is very special to me, but hopefully very special to a lot more people as time goes on. My thanks also to the hundreds of individuals who contributed their time and skills to this project, researchers, translators, assistants, upon whose efforts this work was made possible. There are too many to name, unfortunately, but their involvement, their commitment, and their contribution is hugely appreciated. Most importantly of all, my thanks goes to Luke Holland, without whom this project simply would not exist. I believe the seed for Final Account was planted during Luke's childhood in the jungles of Paraguay. It was there that Luke's mother Gertie revealed to him and his siblings not only their Jewish heritage, but to the fate of their grandparents. Luke's mother, a refugee from Vienna, was told by her mother, Luke's grandmother, never to reveal, she said, I think explicitly, do not tell anybody that you are Jewish. And she took this very much to heart and kept it from her children. But I believe this revelation sparked a question in Luke's mind. How could this happen? How was this tragedy allowed to play out? It would not be for several decades, but inevitably his curiosity drove him to seek an answer for this question from the men and women responsible. This journey began in 2008 and would last for close to a decade. Rather than those who gave the orders, Luke wanted to speak to the ordinary Germans, the Mitläufer, the people without whose participation the crimes of the Holocaust would not have been made possible. There were many challenges that had to be overcome. First and foremost was finding those who would be willing to speak on the record. To do this, Luke employed a variety of tactics, some more obscure than others, but he was tenacious and soon discovered that there were many individuals who were willing and able to do so. One of these tactics, quite obviously, was going to visiting Seniorenheime, speaking and making friends with the directors of these elderly people's homes. Oftentimes there would be volunteers, people who'd be willing, though of course, purely on a purely voluntary basis. No one was getting paid for their contributions. Their contribution is to history. It was a challenging journey, incredibly taxing on Luke. Oftentimes he approached this work as an individual. It was a one-man band, he alone, sometimes with a translator to help him, and a camera. And to manage, I'm still amazed. It's incredible, the achievement to sit across from these people, these emotionally charged situations. Oftentimes, as the interviewees reveal something incredible, little gifts, or maybe gifts is the wrong word, these sort of lifting the veil on the past and holding this conversation, remaining rigorous, challenging them when they need to be challenged, as well as all the technical problems that came up, whether it is as the light fades behind him or the camera runs out of battery, keeping everything in check and everything in balance. It is a monumental feat, an incredible achievement. When I joined Luke on this journey in 2011, I was amazed, not just to hear these voices, but the fact that you could see them as well. Apologies. For me, these testimonies reduced the distance of history. It was remarkable. It was I had never expected to hear them at all. I thought this was, perhaps there would be too much fear, too much doubt. And perhaps I believe if one's to go by the previous efforts, Dory Laub, for instance, at the Fortuna, who developed the Fortuna archive, attempted this work when he was several decades earlier and found much resistance. Perhaps the passage of time weakens people's, maybe weakens is the wrong word. Resolve perhaps diminishes, perhaps there's more curiosity, perhaps there's more willingness to speak. I do not know, but clearly this desire was there. The project was always conceived as an archive first, but one cannot keep the filmmaker down for long. And in 2019, we produced Final Count as a feature-length documentary. It premiered at the Venice Film Festival in 2020 and has since been screened in several countries around the world as COVID restrictions have allowed. The film will be screening in the UK as part of the Jewish Film Festival on the 11th of November this year, followed by a cinematic release across the country. And soon after, as restrictions allow, hopefully it will make its way across the rest of Europe. I would just like to take a moment just to say what a privilege it has been to know Luke, to work on this project. It has opened my eyes in ways and made me consider history in a way I possibly hadn't done before. Not a re-evaluation, but perhaps a reframing. Hearing these voices from the past, the voices of perpetrators, it puts a human face on a part of the tragedy I hadn't possibly considered doing so before. I must say I had not come to this project with a historical background, but certainly one that it has encouraged me to dig deeper. And truly, Luke's work, Luke's contribution, Luke's passion and drive, his utter dedication to history, finding these voices, seeking them out for the benefit, not just for the historical record, but I feel for all of us, on an emotional level, to challenge perpetration, to ask questions and get us to ask questions of ourselves. I am very, very humbled to be here now, and it has been remarkable, and I'm amazed that we are here. And yes, thank you so much to everyone who's supported us all along the way.
Great. Well, I'll take over from here to talk a little bit more broadly about the historical significance and context of these interviews. And Luke was an amazing person. He was a filmmaker, but far more than that, in the way that he managed. I recall going to a conference on perpetrators and second generation in roughly 2012, I think 2013, possibly as late as that, but where he worked his way around the room, quietly chatting to people. And he was very circumspect. He used to say he wanted to capture voices, quote, from the perpetrator's side, which is a very nice expression. Suggesting witnesses to historic times rather than people who are guilty of historic crimes. And I think he wanted to provide the counterpoint to the growing collections of survivor testimonies. Sam already mentioned Dory Laub and the Fortunoff archive. There's the USC Shoah Foundation. There are many others in the meantime. But it's quite clear that without understanding those who were involved in perpetration and who made the system function, we cannot even begin to understand why there were so many victims. And it's entirely one-sided to concentrate purely on the victim and survivor testimony. So I just want to make 3 points about the historical significance of the collection. The first has to do with what I'm calling, with a question mark, the compromised majority. The historiography of the last couple of decades in particular has been delving ever more deeply into the actions and motives of people below the level of the top policymakers, and exploring the significance and the complexity of interactions on the ground in propelling Nazi violence forwards on a massive scale. Meanwhile, we've also been listening more intently to the voices of victims and survivors, whether in testimonies produced at the time or after the war. But those who lived through the violence and participated in the system without becoming rescuers, resistance fighters, or victims themselves are less easily understood. They were not necessarily, as they later cast themselves or have been cast, they were not necessarily innocent bystanders or neutral eyewitnesses, witnesses to the times, Zeitzeugen, as Germans like to call them, however much many of them would have liked to represent themselves in this way. And it's this vast and historically, I think, incredibly significant grey area of those who not only knew what was going on and didn't raise their voices in protest, but who are indeed often also active in some capacity in service of the Nazi cause that Luke's interviews address. Many interviewees want to give an account of what for them may have been the most exciting and significant times in their lives. In their old age, they want to give an account of their own lives and to reckon with what it is they did and what they lived through. And I think going back to Sam's questioning about why this couldn't have been done before, I think there is something about end of life wanting to talk. But if you think who would have been available for such interviews 30 or 40 years ago, these would have been people who were maybe 30 or 40 years older at the time and far more implicated, far more tainted by actual guilty practices. So my second point, the significance of these little people, as they're sometimes called, this is beyond the big Nazis and the obvious frontline perpetrators. And I think Luke often felt a little bit concerned when he was looking particularly for financial backing and funding, that people were wanting something that would be really salacious, that would be really outstanding, that would be big names, massive, the face of evil in the SS. These aren't those people. And I think Luke was at times slightly concerned about that. But it's incredibly important, the people he's tapped, because the people he interviewed are those who made the Third Reich function. They are variously facilitators of the system through the roles they played, however small scale and subordinate. And I'd remind you that right now Irmgard Fürchner is on trial, who was a teenage typist for the commandant of Stutthof. You know, teenage typists you wouldn't think were, as Bildzeitung was trying to cast Fürchner, you know, the face of evil, the frightful Frau Fürchner, as the Bild headline ran, which is great in German, die furchtbare Frau Fürchner, you can hardly say it, it's a tongue twister. So these are facilitators in a small scale. They are those who either witnessed or participated in key incidents and can provide evidence of how they saw things and what they did, how this can be interpreted and represented in ways they feel comfortable with, either at the time or later. And this is an important point. They're not necessarily telling us anything new that we didn't know already when we look up particular incidents that they reference, but they are telling us something about how they wanted to portray it or wanted to portray it later in these interviews. And that is very, very interesting. And furthermore, many of them also show how it was able to internalize Nazified ways of thinking and seeing the world. And this is more subtle and less easy to identify than talking about ideology or worldview might suggest. It's ways of conceptualizing the world and seeing yourself and others, which they betray even now, many of the interviews. And without these people on the perpetrator side, the Nazi system could not have functioned in the way that it did. So these people reveal more, I think, than we get from the policy documents and the ideological statements and some of the action reports. And my third point about the significance has to do with precisely that, the question of worldviews and interpretive frameworks. This third point, I have to begin with a couple of fairly obvious cautionary notes. The people who Luke interviewed were old when he interviewed them, but they were very young in some cases, or somewhat young then. So they are not a representative sample as far as generation is concerned. And that is incredibly important about the Third Reich, because generational engagement with Nazism and the degree to which different generations were affected by Nazi ideology and socialization was very different between older cohorts and younger cohorts. And here we have the younger cohorts who are really exposed to Nazi socialization. And so we can't, as I fear some viewers of the film may be tempted to do, we can't talk about the Germans or whoever. We can't generalize from this particular cohort. We have to remember this is generationally specific. The second caution is that the people who were there, and Sam evoked this very well just now, seem to provide direct access to the past. There is a kind of authenticity claim about speaking to somebody who was there, and that cannot be denied. You do have this sense of, my goodness, it must be real because this person lived it and they remember it. You can see it going through their mind's eye as they speak, and indeed even in their gestures. A person talking about how he pulls his gun out and he gets it ready, you know, and he's gesturing, his body language is betraying the reliving in his mind's eye. But of course, it's not how it really was. This is not an authentic access to the past as it really was. And I think these cautionary notes actually are also strengths if we look at the material in a slightly different way. We can look at it to understand the layering of worldviews and interpretive frameworks over time and according to situation. Some interviewees are far more critical of their former selves, far more surprised about what it is they were involved in, far more self-reflexive than others. And we can uncover different layers of reconsideration and reinterpretation of former actions in the light of later moral frameworks. In other accounts, we can still see evidence of deeply internalized ways of viewing the world, still functioning 3/4 of a century later. And I think this can help us understand certain persisting ways of thinking about, for example, an ethnically defined identity as a member of the folk, or the inferiority, alleged inferiority of other groups. Whether critical or self-justificatory, the accounts also help us to understand the ways in which enormous numbers of people were able to go along with the Nazi system and its violence, something which I perpetually find almost unintelligible when one reads some of the incidents and you think, how could people have done that? These people help us to understand how people could go along with it. And how, for many of them, it could be the most exciting time of their lives. The woman who has her dental treatment in the concentration camp of Mauthausen and is looks after the children of the wife of one of the employees there. It really was the most exciting high point of her life. And the way in which people could be so blinkered as to not think about the wider meaning of what it was that they were witnessing. And I think finally, among these people, what you see are many complexities, many different routes into what we might see as hugely compromising situations. There are people who are there against their will and then have to do certain things. There are people who wanted to be there. There are people who feel uncomfortable about it, people who don't seem to question it. And many different ways of giving a final account under quite different later circumstances. So I think if treated appropriately and in conjunction with other sources from the time and later, this sort of material, which is very, very rich and quite fascinating, can help us to better understand how the Third Reich was not merely a dictatorship sustained by repression, nor a dictatorship upheld by popular adulation of Hitler. That's the classic dichotomy that you get in the debates between coercion and consent that have raged for decades among certain historians, but that it was in effect a far more complex system carried by innumerable individuals in all sorts of different ways, people who were formed by their times and who transformed their later accounts to fit in with later and very different times, and who were prepared then ultimately to give their final accounts to Luke in this amazing material. So I think we're going to see a little bit of Luke himself. He's going to be able to speak for himself in a moment. Thank you.
Yes, so we're about to see, as I mentioned, Luke was a documentarian, which also meant that he kept a very detailed record of his journey, not just interviewing the people who feature in the archive, but very much his own responses to it. So we're about to see a short film from him, seeing as he cannot be here, and afterwards we shall hear from Sir Trevor Perez.
There were many challenges connected with this work. People said, for example, don't waste your time on old Nazis. They're all dead. You won't find them. If you find them, they won't speak to you. And if they speak to you, it will all be nonsense, rubbish. It won't be true. And I went looking for people. I ignored this advice. And I think part of the advice was, we don't really want you to do this. We don't want to hear from these people. This project, I suppose, has its origins in previous films that I've made. One was Good Morning, Mr. Hitler, which involved interviews with elderly people in Munich, the Hauptstadt der Bewegung, as the Germans say, the main city of the movement. And I found them remarkably willing to speak about their involvement, their membership of the Volksgemeinschaft. And I think this probably planted a seed, and then I made a film called I Was a Slave Labourer. And I travelled with Rudy Kennedy, an Auschwitz survivor. I had tracked down an elderly man. He worked for IG Farben, the big corporation who effectively financed Auschwitz. And Rudy met him at his home in Milan and asked him a series of questions.
So on the 30th of April, went to Auschwitz.
Where was in Auschwitz?
And
he went in the night. I went to Auschwitz by train.
can you remember seeing the crematoria? Did you smell some of the terrible?
Yes, I saw the pipes, no? Smoke.
Yes.
Everybody talked about it. There was nothing to hide.
It seemed to me if Rudy was willing to take on these people, these witnesses from the perpetrator side, I mean that's the cohort who've been the focus of my work. If Rudy was willing to put questions to them, then why shouldn't I sort of take up the baton on his behalf? This is not work that's been done with the rigor it merits. There are tens of thousands of interviews done with survivors. My mother, a refugee from Vienna, among them. I think 52,000 witness interviews in the Spielberg archive in Los Angeles. But no one has made a sort of serious attempt to get the voices from what one might characterize as the other side. I made a list early on, and I've looked at it periodically and amended it. You know, what is the purpose of this project? Why are we doing this? How is the material going to be used? The project was always conceived as having three legs, if you like: research, education, and memorial purposes. The item that remains at the top of the list is slightly self-referencing. It's if we don't do it, in 10 years' time, we'll regret not having done it. I've done a total of 250 interviews, including 25 with former SS men. These have not just been people in uniform, haven't just been men, haven't just been Germans. I think these are multiple individual narratives, and they're all extraordinarily different. What they have in common is a time frame, 33 to 45. Some are articulate, contrite, apologetic. They've reflected deeply about what they were part of, and others are completely unamended, entrenched in their racism, in their loyalty to Hitler. I think the post-war silence has been characterized in Germany as das große Schweigen, the idea that people did not want to speak. My experience with elderly people is it's very difficult to stop them from speaking. The question then is how to get to them, to build a relationship where you can have a conversation. Not sure where I'm staying this evening, but the memory hunting has brought me to Frau Unterberger in her 90s now. She worked for members of the local aristocracy in the 30s And I assume also the Nazi aristocracy when they took over in 1938. Grüß Gott, kennen Sie sich hier aus?
Ja.
Ja, ich suche die Frau Unterberger in der Berndbauerstraße.
Das ist die
Das ist. Gibt es eine Straße hinten, kann man rein? Oder ist das die?
Genau, um die Kurve geht die Straße noch weiter.
Okay, danke. Frau Unterberger lives somewhere in one of these houses. Maybe one I've just passed, which is rather frustrating. Now, where do I go? I don't know. For me, one of the most difficult moments in these conversations, they're not interrogations, they're open-ended conversations, which I have with these old people, is when they lever themselves up, and make their way sort of across the sort of interview gap, if you like, and put their arms around me. And I sort of stand there rather awkwardly, uncertain how to respond. And they thank me. Endlich bin ich das los, Herr Holland. At last I've got rid of that. And I think, well, do I want to offer therapy to these people? But in the end, I've decided it's actually a very, very small price to pay for the gifts from the past, which they've given to the record.
Ich war da im Arbeitsdienst. Und dann hieß es, wir fahren nach Kutno und besichtigen auch die Kirche. Da ist das Ghetto, wo die Juden untergebracht sind. Das weiß ich. Mhm.
Aber die Kirche war ein Ghetto jetzt? Oder
ja, die Kirche war ein Ghetto.
Mit Juden drin?
Ja, da waren die Leute drin, mit Kindern und mit Ehepaaren.
Und die Leute das war eingezäunt irgendwie, oder?
Ja, also wie soll ich sagen, das war so ein Raum und rundherum war Stacheldraht. Also Stacheldraht nicht, so dieser Gartenzaun.
Sind Sie sicher, dass es Juden waren? Woher wissen Sie, dass es Juden waren?
Ja, wer sperrt man denn sonst da ein ins Ghetto?
Da ist es.
Dory Laub came up with an interesting line, which I hadn't thought about, but I think it's terribly important. He said he supports this work because of the value it can have to the survivors themselves. Sometimes they doubt the experience, they doubt the truth of their memories, and when they hear, as they now do and will, I've shown some of these footage at a memorial event for survivors, it will confirm their memories. They'll have affirmation from the perpetrator side that what they remember, the nightmares that wake them up, are true, because the elderly people I'm talking to are providing this confirmation. I think another key point is, it was Jonathan Littell who sort of offered me this line. He said, after all, perpetrators are witnesses too. And it's much too easy to dismiss the potential of these people to be historical actors. Some historians, less so now, but used to say, this is a crime without witnesses. The witnesses were all killed. That denies the opportunity of the killers to testify. And we shouldn't give the Nazis a monopoly of dehumanization, which is what they did to the Jews. We shouldn't dehumanize the surviving Nazis, if you like, by denying them the right, if they choose to witness, to testify, and to give their account. Every time a Jewish name comes up, for example, I say, hang on a minute, tell me about this person. And they do, and it's the most extraordinary, the detail with which they can talk about a Jewish classmate, Jewish neighbor, a Jewish doctor. And some of those testimonies may be the only record that exists of our murdered relatives.
Wurde ich beauftragt, mit einer Gruppe Häuser zu gehen, die leer waren. Dass ich in das Haus eines jüdischen Professors kam, wo alles durcheinander zerstört war. Und da fiel mir ein Bild auf. Ein blondes, hübsches, junges Mädchen. Mit einem Gesicht so arisch, wie man es sich nur denken konnte. Ich habe dieses Bild heute noch. Tochter eines jüdischen, polnischen Professors. Im Nachhinein kann ich mir das nicht mehr verzeihen. Das sitzt tief.
My hope is that the film will both pose questions and help the people who see it to pose questions themselves. Answers are always elusive, and answers risk an attempt to tidy stuff up. And this stuff is not tidy. The answers will continue to elude us. How did it happen? Why did it happen? How could this ghastly Holocaust happen at the heart of a so-called civilized Europe? Could it happen again? All legitimate questions. And then what can I, viewer, do to sort of engage with these challenges?
Wow, that was fantastic. I think I'm up next. It was lovely to see Luke again. Very special. So hi, I'm Trevor Perez. I've just asked to say a few words about my some recollections of meeting Luke and our support for this program. Back in 2008, a friend, Roman Halter, called me up. Roman was a well-known Holocaust survivor and one of the most charismatic and inspirational people I've had the pleasure of knowing. He asked me a favor. Please, would I meet with a gentleman he had become acquainted with, called Luke Holland. Luke was apparently working on an unusual project and was in need of a funding partner. Roman was cautiously reserved in his introduction, keen for me to meet Luke, but equally keen that I should form my own opinion of both his project and of Luke himself. On meeting Luke, I started to understand why. He was intense, quirky, and completely committed to his vision, or perhaps mission is a better word, to interview and film witnesses, bystanders, and perpetrators of the Holocaust. I recall Luke's using an imperfect but memorable analogy to contrast the number and scale of archival collections of survivor testimonies with the comparative absence of recorded material from witnesses, bystanders, and perpetrators from this period. If cars are driving onto the pavements and running over pedestrians, he argued, we shouldn't just be interviewing the pedestrians to record their experiences and feelings at being run over. We should also be interviewing the drivers, people who are driving in the car, and understand why they rose onto the pavements and into these pedestrians. Back in 2008, such a project was definitely controversial, and I was uncertain how much or how such interviews would be received. Whilst Luke was clearly a formidable character, I was also uncertain whether the sort of individuals that he wished to seek out would consent to being interviewed at all, let alone on film. And even if they did, would they be remotely honest? So I decided to carry out an informal peer review. I found some neutral to positive voices, but also some firmly negative voices who questioned not only the validity of the project, but also its morality. One senior academic, the director of a leading survivor testimony archive, passionately advised against the idea, saying that these people had their chance to speak between 1939 and 1945. I have no interest whatsoever in what they have to say today. Despite this, we decided to speculate a modest initial grant to see what, if anything, Luke could actually come up with. A few months later, Luke was back in contact, sending over a CD-ROM containing several interviews that he conducted. One viewing was enough to see that this was important work, that Luke had a gift for this work, and that this project, now named Final Account, would be in effect Luke's magnum opus. Now, 15 years later, Luke's vision, hopes, and labors are fulfilled. There is consensus of Final Account's validity, importance, and value. Several respected institutions now have the archive or wish to have access to it. And I'm delighted that UCL is a founding archive in this regard. Luke's legacy is secure and will be a source of study, knowledge, and God willing, an additional guide for us all towards a better understanding of how such atrocities occur and their prevention. Luke was blessed with tremendous charm, chutzpah, and an unfathomable energy. He was not always easy to work with, and that's an understatement. But over the years, I came to hold Luke in very similar regard to our cherished friends, Roman and Susie Halter. Luke had a number of insightful sayings, but one in particular that I often think of is that he remarked that for mass atrocities to occur, it takes the complicity of the masses. In turn, that made me think of a Margaret Mead quote, to never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Luke Holland has changed the world for the better, and I'm very proud to have known him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I will now talk a little bit more about the actual archival collection itself, some of the nuts and bolts and some of the key aspects that might be of interest to prospective users. My own involvement in this project dates back to 2016 when I joined UCL and appraised and catalogued the collection, spending many hours discussing the interviews with Luke. And I've also been working with them in my own research on post-war responses to perpetration and complicity under Nazism, and I've benefited greatly from having that opportunity to discuss the interviews with Luke. Most of his interviews he conducted between 2010 and 2014, and primarily in people's own homes, and almost all of them were filmed. Altogether, the collection contains an incredible 294 interviews with at least 274 named men and women, 150 men and 124 women. A small number of these interviews will remain closed to consultation for now until further notice. The vast majority of the interviews, as Sam has already indicated, around 80% in fact were conducted by Luke alone. And the remainder, interpreters and researchers jointly conducted interviews with Luke, and a very small number of interviews, mostly in Austria, were conducted on his behalf. The predominant language in the interviews is German, in 263 of them. But there's French is the main language in 19 of them, Dutch in 6, English in 4, and Spanish in 2, just to indicate the kinds of languages that are spoken and what kind of research that might be of interest for. Half of all the interviewees were Germans from the so-called Third Reich, if you will, while Austrians make up around 20% and French people just under 10%. There are also ethnic Germans from a range of countries, including Romania and Czechoslovakia, and men and women from the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, and Ukraine. Additionally, there's a set of interviews conducted in Paraguay and Argentina, though most of the German-speaking interviewees here had already either been born there or moved there as children. The conversations in Paraguay and Argentina focus especially on the interviewees' German identity, their attitudes towards Nazi Germany and the war, and local Hitler Youth and BDM groups. Final account, Third Reich Testimonies joins a small and important number of archival collections of audio-video interviews that are accessible at archives such as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Institute for History and Biography in Hagen in Germany, or the Österreichische Mediathek in Vienna in Austria, and that address the side of the perpetrators or the wider German and Austrian populations and their experiences under Nazism. Final account, Third Reich Testimonies is significant for a number of reasons, not least the sheer diversity of the voices, with the collection cutting across the population, including farmers, blue and white collar workers, civil servants, bankers, artists, industrialists, and nobility, with wartime experiences equally diverse, including different types of military service in various theaters of war and a wide range of civilian occupations as well. In around a quarter of the interviews, Jewish acquaintances, friends, neighbors, and other locals are mentioned by name, and I know Luke had hoped that this may provide a useful source for people who are trying to research their family history to find out some of perhaps the last known details about their loved ones. Also, around a quarter of the interviews address violence and atrocities, likely at least in part thanks to Luke's very direct questions in this regard. And around 40 interviews, if not more, feature private photo albums, documents, and medals. Notably, women feature very prominently in occupations that range from homemakers to domestic employment to jobs in education, arts or care sectors, to secretarial work in military, civilian or Nazi organizations. At least 28 of the men served in SS or Waffen-SS, and here we've got Germans, Austrians, Dutch, Belgian and Ukrainian men, and ethnic Germans from Romania and Slovakia. This again underlines really the European dimension to this collection, which should be stressed. The topics in the interviews are incredibly wide-ranging, from youth organizations to war service and experience to the persecution of Jews and other victim groups, and on to post-war reflections. And again, as Mary and Sam have indicated, with a wide range of responses, including Holocaust denial and historical revisionism in at least 40 of the interviews, through to civic engagement and political education in around a dozen of cases. And of course, there are also limits to the collection. For example, if we look at cohort and generation, as Mary has pointed out, the majority of the interviewees were born between 1918 and 1927, even though the wider range is 1905 to 1934. So that means most of them were still children, adolescents in 1933. So they're not part of the generation that conceived of, initiated and organized Nazi policies, war and genocide in the 1930s and 1940s, but who were socialized during the Nazi period and were some of the perhaps most enthusiastic enactors of some of these policies. The collection's strength is that the interviews are of no particular prominence, but that also means that it can be challenging to find out more about them and the events that they talk about. And their advanced age, between 84 and 106 at the time of interview, also raises questions about memory and even senility. And in the case of the German interviewees, most lived in West Germany after 1945, so we don't have as many representatives, as it were, who lived through the GDR and reflect on their past through a different lens. And finally, the main focus is on the period 1933 to 45, so much less so on the post-war period. To help discover this varied collection, we've prepared different aids: a detailed collection guide and finding aid, a collection catalog, a set of transcripts for select interviews, and synopses of all the interviews. And all these materials will be available to registered researchers at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, at INATEC premises in Paris, Lille, Rennes, Strasbourg, Lyon, Toulouse, and Marseille. And for UCL staff and students, access will be through UCL. Before I now hand over to colleagues at the INA, I will share with you an example of how we at UCL have used interviews from the Final Account archival collection for educational purposes in an online exhibition that we curated last year, and which was part of the recently concluded HRC-funded project titled Compromised Identities, Reflections on Perpetration and Complicity under Nazism. For this purpose, we contextualize select excerpts through film discussion, and these films form part of the online exhibition. Part of the rationale behind these films is that voices from the side of the perpetrators, however widely or narrowly defined, are usually absent from exhibitions, partly because some of the serious and justified concerns about providing access to this type of material in a public setting, especially given some of the content, such as examples of Holocaust denial and more broadly attempts at self-exculpation. So our format proposes possible ways of approaching such accounts that are sensitive to the material and which also invite audiences to reflect on their own responses to such interviews, given what Mary has already talked about, the sort of sense of authenticity and as a window into the past. So by contextualizing the interviews and interspersing them with discussion, we hope that viewers or audiences can take a step back and reflect on the interviews in a slightly different way. I will now show a brief excerpt from one of these films where my colleagues and I, in this case myself and Mary Fulbrook, comment on an interview with a German woman born 1924, a former nursery nurse who critically reflects on her own conduct during the war.
Ich habe im Krieg, da schäme ich mich heute noch für, im Krieg kamen uns 5 oder 6 Polinnen entgegen. Und wir waren genauso viele deutsche Mädchen. Und nun kamen wir auf den Bürgersteig und eine ging runter von uns, vom Bürgersteig, weil wir nicht aneinander vorbeikamen. Und da habe ich gesagt, wieso gehst du denn runter vom Bürgersteig? Ja, ich hatte doch keinen Platz da mehr. Ich sag, das sind doch Polacken, die hätten jammernd runtergehen können. Da blieb eine Polin stehen und sagt, ich bin Polin. Sie sind deutsch. Sie können nicht dafür, dass sie deutsch sind. Ich kann nicht dafür, dass ich Polen bin. Aber Polack bin ich nicht. Da hätte ich nämlich, also die hätte befürchten müssen, dass ich Polizei gerufen hätte oder hier so ein Propagandaleiter, die da in Uniform dauernd rumkannten, Bescheid gesagt hätte, Ortsgruppenleiter nannten die sich. Ne, hier, die Polen da, die katscht euch mal, dann wäre die weggewiesen. Nicht? Und so waren wir Deutschen, leider Gottes.
So I think that's very rare that someone does acknowledge shame in relation to their own behavior. Although one could argue that that is more of a moral lapse rather than something that would constitute more legal guilt, which would be her denouncing someone for which she could have been tried after the war in the early post-war period.
Und dies, was ich jetzt alles so frei erzähle, dass ich es begriffen habe, dass die Nazis Verbrecher waren, das mögen auch viele nicht zugeben, weil sie selber mit dabei waren. Im Endeffekt war ich ja auch dabei. Ich habe das ja auch mitgemacht. Aber ich habe keinen ins KZ gebracht und ich habe auch keinen angeschwärzt. Das hätte aber auch kommen können, wenn meine Eltern nicht gesagt hätten, du holst ihn die Schnut, du hältst seine Schnauze.
But she has really sought to demonstrate that she now sees it all differently. I mean, she is reflecting from a different standpoint on a past where she says, I was complicit, I used the terminology Polak, I was party to this German superiority. I would have denounced somebody for being anti-Nazi because I was so in favour of what the Nazis were doing. I was only stopped from denouncing by my parents saying, don't do that. And we don't know whether in fact, on another incident or another occasion, she might actually have denounced somebody.
Ich wusste auch, welche die auf die Nazis geschimpft haben. Und da habe ich gesagt, wenn der hier nochmal kommt und hier so auf die Nazis schimpft, der war Milchkontrolleur. Ich sage, dann zeige ich ihn an. Und da hat erst meine Mutter gesagt, oder das lässt du gefälligst bleiben. Und dann hat mein Vater auch, das darfst du nicht. Ne? Also das tust du nicht.
If you're interested in the rest of the films, we did make in total 9 of them at this point, with this being an example of maybe one of the more reflected persons that Luke interviewed, but there are also examples that they are somewhat different from that. But I'll post the link to the exhibition in the chat in just a moment. But now Mileva Stupar, Director of Heritage Collections, Robert Dublov, Project Manager, and Claude Mizu, Head of INATEC, will talk to us about the Institut National de l'Audiovisual, which has had a long-standing relationship with Luke and Zef Productions and this project, and which is ensuring both the long-term preservation of the interviews and access for researchers through its digital infrastructure.
Good evening, everyone. It is an honor for me tonight to speak on behalf of the French National Audiovisual Institute, INATEC, and tell you about its involvement in this major archival project. There were many reasons for it. Giving access to the past is certainly one of them, but providing keys to reflect on and understand our past and our society is definitely another one. The 3 purposes Luke Holland chose as guiding, as cardinal values for his work, and that his interview with Luke Fraser made us heard earlier, namely research, education, and memorial purposes, strongly echo our mission. They are the reasons why we archive, protect, digitize, and share our collections every day. So it was quite natural that alongside UCL, we contributed to the indexation and description of the interviews that were conducted. And since it holds a very special place amongst our collection, and though I have to keep it very short, I'd like to mention and thank some of the people at INA who contributed to it and knew Luke: Sylvie Blum, Valérie Chomel, Agnès Magnin, Barbara Mutz, Eleonore Alquier, Claude Mizu, who is amongst us tonight, and Robert, who is next to me right now, and with Anne Tilliard and Waymanhu Maliarkis, took on this indexation and description work, and is going to tell you a bit more about it just now.
Okay. Thank you. Do you hear me well? Yeah, okay, thank you. So good evening. My name is Robert Dublov. and I work in the INA's documentation department. Thanks to the catalogue of interviews designed by Dr. Stefanie Rauch for UCL, a catalogue that Stefanie has continued to enrich and improve since its creation, the cataloging service of INA was able in 2018 to create in the Institute's databases the Littell found. I will not repeat here what Stefanie just said about the number of interviews, the number of witnesses, and the configuration of the interviews itself. But on the basis of these about almost 300 documents, INA, from a documentary point of view, carried out 2 operations, plus 1. Firstly, a transcription of the interviews of 10 women and men witnesses, 4 in German, 6 mainly in French, but with also sometimes passages in German or English, which corresponds to 19 days of interviews, 33 hours of interviews, and more than 1,200 pages of transcription. These transcriptions at the time had a dual purpose: provide written support for the selection of excerpts for Luke Holland, who was preparing a documentary, and help researchers to find relevant extracts for their work. And secondly, a documentary description of 32 interviews, 4 of which took place in German. In addition to the cataloging elements like titles, dates, duration, etc., these descriptions include in French the interview's abstracts and some related keywords. It also includes in English, and as for all these collection documentary records, the summaries on keywords taken from Stefanie's catalogue. It should be noted that some legal notes not visible for the researchers are added to this, which contain details concerning the identity of the witnesses, full date of birth, place of birth, maiden name. Finally, a questionnaire was carried out in collaboration with the INA producer Sylvie Bloom in view of the realization by her care of a major interview with Luke Holland, which has since been conducted, if not finalized. Thank you.
So I'm Claude Mizu, and I'm head of INATech, as was mentioned before, which is INA's division in charge of accompanying research work from its collection. So I'm following through on how INA has been involved in the cataloging technical process and even legal process to make this incredibly valuable collection available for research purposes, as Stefanie mentioned, from 3 different institutions: UCL, Wiener Holocaust Library, and in all of 6 premises of INATech in France. So INA has long-standing and very close ties with the community of historians in France and abroad, actually, and many research works have been and are conducted on the World War II period using INA's broadcast or film press archives. So Luke's legacy of film testimonies with this threefold approach of somehow ego history, or at least family history, historical investigation, and, as was mentioned, unprecedented testimonial campaign from the Nazis' perpetrator side or compromised majority side will undoubtedly trigger interest and offer new perspective for researchers. So the collaboration between our 3 institutions and the prospects of fostering transnational research with the collection is, of course, very enticing, exciting even, and we will engage in building an academic network that will perpetuate and expand Luke's engagement to create new historical sources in the field of Holocaust studies. Of course, many things remain to be invented as far as research collaborations are concerned. For instance, providing tools and support for a possible scientific approach to using the interviews transcripts and navigate in the bulk of those testimonies, especially when knowing that the 6 testimonies in French that have been transcribed amount to 620 pages. So indeed, tools and support to explore this will be needed. Also, we could think of organizing seminars, offering awards, even actually grants to researchers that will use, explore, and analyze the material, and possibly many other initiatives might be invented that will allow the dissemination of researchers' work from the collections. So I guess we have it now into our hands to enable new lives and continuations to Luke's work and engagement, and INAD has actually pledged support and participation to do so. So now I'm leaving the floor to Dr. Toby Simpson, who is a director of the Wiener Holocaust Library.
Thank you, Claude, and good evening, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted and very grateful that the final account testimonies will be made accessible in the library's beautiful reading room in Russell Square in London. And for anyone attending tonight who doesn't know the library, it was used extensively by Luke as he was developing and completing this project, which is perhaps not surprising because it's a very special and important collection. It's actually the oldest collection of evidence of Nazi crimes in the world. Founded in 1933 by Dr. Alfred Wiener, who was a German Jew forced to leave Berlin in order to be able to continue his work documenting Nazi crimes. And Wiener was raising the alarm around the world about the threat posed by the Nazis to civilized values in general, but to the Jews in particular. Today, the library is Britain's largest collection holding institution focused on the Holocaust and other genocides, and it has a crucial role to play in both the spheres of culture more broadly, but academic research especially. And we hold several collections that I think will complement Final Account especially well. And that includes the vast, we provide access to the vast collections of the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, which has been mentioned tonight and was also mentioned by Luke in the film that we saw. Also the Fortunoff Testimonies collection, I think, have also been mentioned and will, I think, be useful and very complementary to this collection to any researchers who visit the library. Some of you may also not know that we provide access to the 30 million pages of the International Tracing Service Digital Archive. And just mentioning that scale of the huge amount of content that we can provide access to, I think it's going to be invaluable to researchers who, perhaps who might be interested in undertaking work to link the events and people described in Final Account to contemporaneous physical evidence. So if anyone here tonight would like to register their interest in using the Final Account collection at the library, please do send us an email. I'll post an address in the chat shortly. But I think you probably have an idea now of the reasons why Luke was so keen that these accounts would be made accessible by us. He was a reader at the library for many years, and he had an instinctive feeling for the special importance of our collections. I remember Luke showing me some of the earlier footage from his project in the days when we used to burn these kinds of things onto DVDs. And even though I'd only just met Luke, he was eager to listen to what I thought of the interviews. And of course, I was fascinated by them and instantly won over by the project. I'm so pleased it's now come to fruition. It's an honor to be here this evening, and I want to pay tribute to some of the people who have done so much to support the project and to ensure the successful creation of an extraordinary resource which we're launching today. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you to Ben Barker, who was my predecessor at the library as director. Ben made a major contribution to the project as an advisor, but also, and perhaps more than that, he was a close friend to Luke and a champion of him and his work through very difficult times. So on behalf of everyone involved in the project, I'd like to thank Ben for sticking by Luke and sticking by the project through thick and thin. I'd also like to thank other staff members at the library who were involved in assisting in different ways and at different times. Bridget McGing, Christine Schmidt, Howard Folkson, Greg Taut, and Leah Sidebotham, who's also here this evening, who's been providing technical support. I'd like to thank all of them for their contributions to the project. I'd like to thank Stefanie, Mary, Sam Pope, colleagues at Wiener who've just heard from, and other partners. Without the collaboration that we've fostered and we've brought into being, and that Luke has brought into being, this just wouldn't have been possible, and we wouldn't have this extraordinary resource. Thank you to all of the people I've mentioned. But of course, above all, we're grateful to Luke, who was just an extraordinary person. I'll treasure my memories of him, and I know others at the library will too. We're looking forward already to welcoming people to engaging with this resource now and for many years to come. With this research, with these films, Luke has provided us with an amazing living legacy. And that's a fitting thing, because it seems to me that Luke's work was always about people first and foremost, in all of their unvarnished complexity. So I'm very pleased that I now have the chance to hand over to Yvonne Hennessy, Luke's wife, who will share her thoughts with you all. Yvonne.
Thank you, Toby. In 2008, Luke decided to answer a question that had been haunting him for decades, probably since he first discovered his Jewish heritage during his teenage years. How was it possible for ordinary citizens to hit this effort and to ultimately be part of a movement that undertook the murder of millions of innocent people, the majority of them Jews, including his Czech grandparents and other family members? As he started to plan what was to become the Final Account archive project, he was repeatedly warned by various experts that the elderly former Nazis would mostly be dead, or they wouldn't remember, or they would lie. He was also told that no one would be interested or would support, yet alone fund such a project. Notwithstanding these warnings, Luke remained committed to creating his own warning from history. And so he spent the following 12 years searching for, persuading, and interviewing elderly people who had been involved in one way or another as witnesses to and/or perpetrators in Hitler's final solution. In the field, he worked mostly alone, carrying heavy equipment and going back each night to rented accommodation to do the technical work necessary to ensure that the footage filmed each day was safe and securely stored. Tragically, this archive and the accompanying documentary film ultimately became Luke's final account, as he struggled to continue researching, traveling, and filming through treatment for various cancers, almost losing his life in early 2015 to lymphoma of the central nervous system. The success of groundbreaking medication, followed by stem cell treatment at the Royal Marsden Hospital in the summer of that year, meant that although now disabled, Luke continued with his work as soon as he'd learned to walk again, initially with the aid of an electric buggy, then a Zimmer frame, and finally just a stick and calipers. My husband was tenacious, brave, stubborn, and utterly single-minded. He was also a quite brilliant solo cameraman and interviewer. My sons and I are so very proud of this incredible achievement.
Thank you, Yvonne. We will now move on to questions and comments. There have already been many in the chat, well, I'm sure there's lots to discuss, and there were many questions and comments. And I think it's Leah Seidbotham from the Wiener Holocaust Library who will be managing our discussion.
Hi, yeah, I have taken a note of the questions that are in the chat, but I'd just like to encourage anybody else who has any others just to carry on putting them there, and we'll kind of work through as many as possible that we have in the time remaining. So the first question that I'm going to kind of take that Mike Goodman has asked is, how does this project differ from undertakings such as that in the Shoah documentary?
I think a lot of the other questions, it would need to be somebody like Stefanie, who's watched every single interview and really can answer very authoritatively. But how does this differ from Shoah? I think I think in some respects Luke was influenced by Landsmann's work, but he was really determined to get at a far wider range of people on the perpetrator side, not so much to explore specific sites as Shoah does, not so much to go around and try and understand Chelmno or wherever, and to find survivors and victims as well as the occasional perpetrator. Landsmann has interviewed people from the perpetrator side, but they don't come out in Shoah as much as they perhaps might have done. And you can see more interviews with them in the USHMM excerpts, the transcripts and the cuttings, the stuff, the outtakes that Landsmann didn't use, but they don't feature in the film so much. Whereas I think Luke was really determined to get to the heart of what it was that was going on among people who were on the perpetrator side.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think one major difference is also that Luke didn't operate with a hidden camera during his interviews. Everyone knew they were being interviewed, that they were being filmed. And this is also in response to a question that I think is also in the chat a bit later on about release or consent forms. The vast majority of interviewees signed a release form, and those who didn't, there was recorded consent on camera. So there was very little doubt that people consented to being interviewed. There are a few exceptions where consent wasn't recorded explicitly on camera, but these are really in the minority. So I think that is a major difference, that Luke did not want this to be a kind of cloak and dagger operation. And so this also means that the camera work is very good. I mean, the quality of the interviews is quite amazing, because he is able to direct the camera directly at people rather than from hidden in a bag or whatever Landsmann might have used. Bit like Landsmann, he does focus a lot on the detail. He takes people through their recollections or their accounts and tries to get at the detail of what they did, what they remember, what they see, who they knew. So I think there's a bit of a similarity there. I think somewhat unlike Landsmann, Luke was specifically interested in the post-war responses of the people that he interviewed. So a large part of the interviews is generally given over to asking people fairly abstract or challenging questions about what do they think is a perpetrator. Do they accept that the figure of 6 million murdered Jews? And so I think there's a very different emphasis compared with Landsmann's interviews in that regard.
Thank you. Another question from Janice asks whether Luke was able, or whether any of you have been able to verify the accounts that he was given by the interviewees. Has there been kind of any check against the historical record?
I think because of the large number of people that he interviewed, I don't think it was just simply not possible to be checking each and every one of them. As far as I know, it was done in particular occasions. I think there is one of the interviewers or co-interviewers of Luke, Iris Wachsmuth, is here today. I'm not sure if she's still with us, but in case you would like to say something about this, please feel welcome to speak. So in case of one interviewee who was a secretary to Joachim Mugowski, fairly intense archival work was done to confront her with some of the documents that might have passed her desk, or that an affidavit that she wrote in his defense at Nuremberg. And also in some other cases, archival records were sought out, but obviously this is easier in the case of someone who was in the SS than it is someone who was a farmhand in some rural part in Germany. So it was done, I think, as far as I'm aware, where it was possible, but not wholesale. I don't know, Sam, if you have anything to add there.
No, not much more than what you've pointed out. Yes, in some instances where the record was available, I think in a couple of occasions in the archive there are repeat visits to the same interviewee, and that is normally accompanied with more research, having sort of explored this past, explored the previous account they've given, to see if there's any more information that we can Luke could confront them with. But yes, by and large, again, very, very difficult to drill into a lot of these accounts, purely because of their low stakes nature. I think, yes, yeah, as farmers go, difficult.
Perhaps that offers another opportunity for future research that somebody else can do. Another question from Edward Westerman asks about whether any of the interviews describe or may help us understand gender relations under the Third Reich. Does this aspect come to the fore in any of the interviews? And then Katrin adds to that and asks if you could expand on the roles of the women interviewed, if possible.
I would say that, well, as with the previous aspect, this may well be someone's future research project, working with the collection and exploring especially gender as part of their research. I would say it was not one of Luke's, it was not Luke's focus looking at gender. So that may also then explain why maybe there weren't specific questions, or why that wasn't explored in depth. But even without that, gender is quite an interesting one. Not only are there more female interviews than in some comparable collections, perhaps, they are asked about their own involvement rather than just simply what they knew, or their spouses or fathers' involvement, for instance. So we do have a much wider range and more insights, I think, into their own activities and their own roles at the time. Looking at some of the roles, I mean, I already hinted at it in what I said earlier, at the kinds of roles or occupations that women held. Some of the maybe more noteworthy ones might be already aforementioned secretary of Joachim Rogowski. There was then the home economist and cook for the Goebbels family, a bit more obscure. Then a female, a woman who worked for an import-export company, who was assigned a civilian rank of general, and was sent to Ukraine to set up the business there. And that's an interesting one because she speaks quite, she addresses that topic quite explicitly, where she talks about herself as being almost like a proto-feminist, with her husband being the stay-at-home dad and her being this quite independent and confident businesswoman, as it were. So there are various really interesting examples. In terms of masculinity, again, this is not something that comes through explicitly, but I'm sure there will be lots of opportunities for research. One interesting example where gender is a topic in one of the, for the male interviewees, quite explicitly someone who was in the Waffen-SS quite relatively, I think he was only born 1929, so relatively young by the time the war ended, and who blames his what he sees as his feminized upbringing as being responsible for having fallen prey to the Waffen-SS, and blames his mother for raising him in that way. So there are lots of interesting opportunities, even though it may not have been a specific topic.
Thank you. Just in response to one question, yep, this event has been recorded and we will circulate it and make it available afterwards. There's a couple of questions about future plans for the archive in general. So are there plans to make these interviews available from any US institutions and or online at any point?
For US institutions, it was always Luke's ambition to make this, to provide this archive to US institutions. And I believe we are currently in talks, but nothing agreed just yet. But the plan is to make it available soon.
Brilliant. And then further to that, a question about the transcripts. I know they're only in a selection at the moment. Are there plans to expand that at any point?
Well, at the moment, there is just a selection and the fairly detailed synopsis for all of the interviews. I'm also currently working on compiling a source collection with further transcribed and translated excerpts from the Final Account archive. In terms of transcribing all of the interviews, that's something that we'll have to see if we can raise the funding for it, because it would be quite a massive enterprise doing that.
Could I just add to that? Trevor Perez, who made a contribution earlier in this session, was modest enough not to blow his own trumpet, but I think we should take this opportunity to thank the Perez Foundation and Trevor in particular for having put an enormous amount of financial backing into this project, and in fact supporting a lot of the current activities that are related to it. So I think we should take this opportunity to just mention Trevor particularly at this point, and the Perez support for the project. But it will need a lot more investment and time if we want to make it more available in the ways that some people have been just asking about.
Definitely. There's also a few questions about Luke's approach that maybe Sam or Yvonne may be best placed to answer. There's a question about whether Luke also took part in the editing and whether the landscape footage is used in a kind of elusive or symbolic way. I don't know whether that is a conscious decision.
Is this in relation to the feature documentary or to the clip we saw earlier, or is there? I'll answer both. For the feature documentary, Luke was absolutely part of the edit. We were incredibly lucky. He was with us throughout, from the very beginning to the very end when we finally locked the cut. So very much it is his influence and his decisions are there represented on screen. And for the short that we saw earlier, I'm afraid I cut that over the weekend and a little bit before. So there's that is myself trying to channel as best as possible what Luke might want or how he'd like to be represented.
Can I just say that Luke was originally, first and foremost, a photographer, and he started many years ago his career working in South America on behalf of Oxfam, Christian Aid, War on Want, as a photographer documenting the situation of Indians in Paraguay, where he grew up. And he had an exhibition of his photographs on at the ICA in 1980, and then he and I toured it in the States in 1981. It was called Hunting the Pig People, Indians, Missionaries, and the Promised Land. So he had a remarkable eye, and therefore I would say that he was very, very selective and careful about how he framed shots, the background, the lighting, everything, because he came to it from a photographer's perspective as well as all the other skills that he brought to the situation.
Thank you. A couple more questions about Luke's kind of interviewing technique. The first one asking whether it's kind of biographical or journalistic / thematic. Did he have a set approach when he went about these interviews? Do you know?
I think perhaps Stefanie I'd be interested to hear what Stefanie has to say from her observation. I know when Luke went into these interviews, he went in with a certain set number of questions, certain themes he wanted to tackle, including, more esoteric questions about perpetration and personal opinions, personal reactions. Very often the interviews would begin with childhood and then slowly build up from there. But it wasn't strict in a sense. If there was an interesting thread, or if there an interviewee raised a point that, again, Luke going in very well researched, very well prepared, if it was an interesting topic, they would allow the interview to go down that path, as it were, to explore the anecdote, to explore their feelings and thoughts about it, their memories.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see it that way as well. There was not necessarily always a clear structure, but overall there was most interviews followed a similar-ish kind of path. We're starting with the project introduction, then a sort of life history section where people were able to talk about a bit more freely about their lives, especially up to 1933, and then specific follow-up questions that focus especially on 33 to 45, and then a kind of fourth section, which was more some of these esoteric or questions about more abstract ideas and reflections. In terms of the style, I think I always saw it as kind of oscillating between trying to build a good working relationship with the people that he interviewed, but then also sometimes blending maybe more into some kind of interrogation, depending on how the interview dynamics went, which obviously could differ quite substantially depending on who we interviewed. So overall, I would think it was quite an inquisitive style of interviewing, and so perhaps more from a journalistic tradition, but that's not necessarily the case throughout.
Yeah, and sorry, just to add on the end, and I think it's been raised on a couple of occasions, but Luke very often, and he would say this often, he framed these not as interviews but as conversations. In terms of having a rigid framework, I think he wanted to keep it, and I think that's part of the reason why people felt comfortable speaking to him, speaking about these incidents. It wasn't an interrogation; it was very much, yes, a sort of a conversation between equals, and I think that's the feeling he wanted to have established in this dynamic.
Thank you. I think this is perhaps the last question, unless anybody has anything burning to put in the chat now, and it's a question from Caroline about getting hold of interviewees. How did Luke source the people that he interviewed? Were there connections between them? Did they kind of lead on to the next?
On a number of occasions, yes. I wouldn't say it was not the majority, but certainly, I mean, quite often in Seniorenheim, you would find one interviewee would lead to another one. And so Luke would find himself conducting interviews perhaps around a group of friends. And he would often interview them individually and then bring them all together to have a group discussion. So that you'd have these individual accounts, and then the accounts would sort of be challenged, they'd be bounced off, the memories would be jogged by each other. And you have particularly interesting insights from some groups, of course, who've been living in the same area for the entirety of their lives. And so they've known each other since childhood. So you get some very interesting interactions there. On occasion, there were introductions who you might want to speak to my friend and giving your phone numbers through contacts. But I think the majority were found organically and sort of in isolation, but a few were referred.
Can I just add to that? Whenever we traveled anywhere, Luke spoke to people. He listened to them, and he seemed to develop a sixth sense, especially if they were a little older than us, quite a bit older than us. He talked to people on trains, he talked to people in saunas, he talked to people when he was swimming, invariably in the nude, in a lake, around Berlin. He talked to people. He made friends with people. And he was always interested in them and encouraging them to talk about their lives. So I think actually he was very well experienced and able to find people and get them to open up.
And just to add briefly to that as well, is that he also had help through kind of local contacts, researchers that he knew, and in some cases had the support from the local Zeitzeugenbörsen, so those charities that send contemporary witnesses, so-called contemporary witnesses, into schools or other public settings. So maybe about a dozen or so of those people that he interviewed would also do some educational work, in addition to some others who wrote memoirs and biographies, but I'm not entirely sure whether he found them through that or whether that was a coincidence that they had also published memoirs.
I'd like to also mention two people that were on this evening's event, Caroline Goldie in Berlin and Iris Wachsmuth also in Germany, who were incredibly helpful to him in many, many ways, sometimes helping him to find interviewees. So yes, those two deserve very special mention.
Thank you. Can you listen? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Yvonne. And I'm really overwhelmed about all of you and how far this project is developed with these archives. And we were really so much looking for support, Luke, and when I was with him, tried to get some attention about the project and all these critics and all these critical questions about how important is that, or how useful is that, how much sense that makes, all what you mentioned and explained. And so yeah, thank you, all of you. And I think I'm working with students, and I think this is so important to have this incredible material, and there's so much to do still, researching, finding new questions, and having this shots, what is almost really Luke's work and energy of these whatever perpetrators they are, and and also that new generations have maybe new questions, and it is a going on thing to develop. Thank you very much.
I think in terms of questions, that's pretty much all we've got time for. I noticed that Stefanie has put the contact details for INA, for the Wiener Holocaust Library, and for UCL in the chat there. So if you have any questions, get in touch with us.
Yeah, thank you all very much for coming tonight. And I'm sure there will be future events following the archive, or the actual launch on the 15th of November. And as and when perhaps future partners are added to the list of archives from where access to final account can be had. If there's nothing else that anyone would like to say, then I would like to thank you all and wish you a lovely evening, and hope to see you all soon.